Invisible Experts Podcast.
Hugo, hello everyone. For me, it's an honor to have a friend of mine, Ed Dixon, Dr. Ed Dixon. How are you, man? How's it going?
Man, thanks for having me. It's going pretty well. Sun is shining. We have good weather. So I definitely can't complain. Can't complain.
Thanks, man.
The regular stresses of academic life, as you can imagine, deadlines and all the admin stuff that you have to sort out. But I guess that goes with the territory. So pretty much it's going well.
Fantastic, man. Dude, thanks for being part of this series of podcast of invisible experts. And of course, I wanted to kind of catch up with you and talk about different stuff. So we really appreciate the fact that you are with us and your willingness to participate on this little project.
Thank you very much.
And so, man, so someone who is very well educated, no, because I did my homework, no, masters in social policy, international relationship as a bachelor, then doctor of philosophy and PhD in social entrepreneurship, and then you also have experience as a program manager, research assistant, civil society coordinator, and then you ended up in academia, huh?
Yeah.
Which is fantastic. So what are you up to now?
All right, so now I'm presently lecturing at the University of the West Indies Five Islands campus. That's in St. John's, Antigua, for your audience. I don't know how familiar they are with the Caribbean. So the University of the West Indies is one of the premier universities in the Caribbean. It has been around for the past 75 years. So we have a good tradition, and I think they'll let you know that they're among the top 1.5% in terms of universities within the Caribbean, within the Latin America and the Caribbean region, and by extension, the world. So there we might be little known worldwide, but we're making a splash in our little neck of the woods. So I'm in Antigua. We've opened a new campus recently, 2019. We have expanded to our fourth, what we call landed campus. So we have three landed campuses, one in Jamaica, which is the Mona campus. The other is the Cayville campus, that's in Barbados. And then we have the St. Augustine campus, that's in Trinidad and Tobago. And so now we also have what we call the Open University, which the Open Campus, which, based on how you understand how it is, the distance education component, the university always wants to be able to tap into different persons who might not be able to capture or get a chance to go to any of the landed campuses, so give them an opportunity to experience and to further their education as well. So we have one, open campus, the distance campus, and then finally we have the Five Islands campus, which is the newest kid on the block, as you can imagine. So just about 4 years old, and growing. So the aim is to really cover the OECS region, that is the Eastern Caribbean region, which includes the Windward and Leeward Islands. Again, for those who are on cue with their geography, you'll have an idea as to where we are.
Amazing, man. Terrific. That sounds really interesting. I have to visit though.
You
So
should.
in what areas are you working right now? Because I read I don't know if it was the last article that you wrote, but it
Mhm.
was about philanthropic actions in the creative and cultural industries in
Yeah.
Jamaica. And that
Yes.
was very interesting. So you're
Yes.
still working on this or you working on something else?
We have there's I guess so much on the table. I think what has happened in recent time is that the academic side, the administrative side of academia, just balancing, just the everyday things with trying to do the research side of things. It's getting that balance, and I guess I'm still kind of wrapping myself around getting that balance sorted. But a lot of different things. Some of them are along the line of what would have been I've been doing and the interest that I have, and then others have kind of been in terms of you're working with other people, you're kind of building on some new areas of interest as well. So it varies. I am definitely still interested in philanthropy. I have this broader concept of what I call the cultural solidarity economy that I'm working on, and a lot of what I'm doing still revolves around that idea of understanding the nexus between public, private, third sector organizations in a very fluid way, and seeing how the work of third sector, how they're taking on social entrepreneurial kind of approaches, how businesses are relying on third sector and governmental organizations to carry out some of their own, whether private, for-profit objectives or more philanthropic, corporate social responsibility kind of activities, and just the fluidity between these different actors. So that's a big part of what I'm looking at. Throughout my PhD journey, I've been very much interested in this idea of reciprocity and understanding in how it manifests itself in different spheres of our life. And I guess part of what I've looked at is how we have actually retained a lot of the traditions that we have. As we mentioned earlier, that we are a society that was colonized, and so we had a lot of persons coming from different countries in Africa, and so they brought along a lot of their cultural traditions that have withstood the test of time. In many cases, the idea of giving, how we give, what we give, we give off time, we give off our sweat equity in a lot of ways. We have evidence of it being, seen in practice, very informal practices across different Caribbean countries. So the fascinating thing about it is that it will have different names, but it has the same characteristics, right? So one idea I'll share with you is one that we call, in Jamaica, we call it day for day. And it essentially is, say you are from, and essentially the most often, well, not exclusively, rural kind of phenomenon where you are farming and you are a farmer, you're probably trying to clear a piece of land. Other farmers will come and actually assist you in clearing that land. And the idea is that when they have their clearing, you would also help. So it's a reciprocal type of relationship that came, and it is manifested in many different areas, as I said, so which is why my kind of interests are very broad. So it manifests in very much work, those types of informal work setting, but we also have what we call partner, which is a reciprocal form of funding, very informal form of funding where people pool their resources and people alternately get access to that resource over time. So that's another practice that comes from this idea of suso from Western Africa. Many of them have this idea of pooling funds. Many, would have had, occasions. So the literature speaks about the idea of suso as well, and it is something that has, kind of been retained by many of, our in terms of our country. Different countries within the Caribbean have different variations of this idea of suso. I think it also mirrors something that is in the American society called the giving circles. I don't know if you've heard about the idea of a giving circle, but it has a similar kind of ways in which it operates. So there's a lot of those types of retention, and there's another I am very much interested in, and it connects with my thesis in that it is showcased in the creative and cultural industry, but also in the sphere of small business. And it's this idea that it's called, we call it how do I say it? We call it the round robin, right? And this idea is it takes a similar principle from the SUSO, where what happens is that I will be hosting an event. So I own a community bar or a business, and so all other related bars would support my business. So they'll tell everyone to support my business, and then we have a revolving scheme where the next one is someone else's bar, and everyone goes to support their endeavor. So it has it started out, it has its philanthropic roots, but it also has implications for the commercial side of things, where people have started to collaborate around, our idea of capitalism is that it's very individualistic, it's very competitive, but this idea now of actually collaborating as persons who are in the commercial sphere is something that is very new to Western kind of literature in terms of how it is done. So I am very much interested in these areas. I am also interested in terms of how we build out the idea of social entrepreneurship, social economy within the Caribbean region. Again, drawing on some of the themes I mentioned earlier, how we have been able to connect with our African traditions, how we have, connected, how we do the same, something similar, how they are different from what used to happen before, seeing how we'd have developed. And so we'd have been able to connect, draw lessons from the European societies. So we have a strong tradition of friendly societies and industrial societies, which is coming out of a lot of the work that was done in the UK. So we have a lot of laws around friendly societies, burial societies that have their genesis in the European context. And so we're trying to understand, the things that we would have retained from our African heritage, but also things that we would have gotten from our interactions with Europeans. So
Wow.
those are some of the areas. Generally as well, I am interested in the corporate social responsibility. I want to understand the role of foundations. And there's the work that, so the genesis, the nexus between private for-profit organization, the work they do, the social side of the work that they do, and trying to understand the motivation behind it. The literature speaks to it being a part of their marketing, so they do it essentially to build brand loyalty and so on. But in the Caribbean context, we're kind of seeing where many of them are trying to actually give back, in a real way. We're not saying that it's not connected to wanting to create that brand loyalty, but they understand that the tradition of giving back is a part of, the Caribbean experience, and so wanting to actually, be a part of that and understanding why they do it is another part of what, where my own interests are in terms of research.
Amazing, man. And I was wondering, because of course I know just very little about Jamaican culture and society. So do you reckon Jamaicans tend to be like community based and work in collaborations and in networks? Because, like reading through what you just mentioned, there is a lot of grouping, helping to each other, help groups, right? Solidarity, reciprocity.
Yes.
So do you reckon there is this kind of a spirit of collaboration in Jamaica?
Yes. So it is very strong. It's a very strong thing you will find, and I've seen it in especially in the rural areas. You'll see a very strong sense of community. In societies where you have people knowing each other, like literally knowing each other, knowing whose grandparents, knowing people's families. And so there's a very close-knit type of society in many of the rural areas. Some of it has transcended to urban areas, but you understand how migration would have affected, in some respect, how the communities develop and form and so on. And we've also had instances of strong tribal politics that has affected, the cohesiveness of some of our communities, both internally and in, relation to other communities. So in days of, in the 1970s and 80s, we had a very, how would I say it, a very violent confrontations between people of different communities based on which political parties they supported. And so, it has kind of damaged a lot of, damaged to some extent, just the cohesiveness of many communities. But probably as someone who is not from those communities, and you go in, you still see evidence of, people wanting the best for their communities and so on. So it's still a very strong thing in terms of, that sense of reciprocity, that solidarity that still remains. But I have to really admit that it has been affected in large measure by, that tribal politics that has, kind of taken grip since the 1960s, 70s, and so on. But what we had was a very strong community network. So we have this organization called the Social Development Commission, which its mandate is to build the capacity of community-based organizations. So there is a very strong local governance structure that feeds. So it starts with what we call CBOs, community-based organizations, and other community-based hierarchical structures within the community. And that then feeds into parish-based. In Jamaica, we have 14 parishes, which would be similar to probably provinces where you are. And so you have a strong network of community organizations, community-based organizations, and so on. So whilst I think the strength of these organizations has diminished over, say, the last 30 or 40 years, the essence and the backbone of it still remains.
Wow. Very, very interesting. But listen, I want to just poke a little bit in your persona, right?
Right.
Because, we as a professionals, we are more than our profession,
Yes.
We have different phases. And I was wondering why, like since the beginning, you were so interested in relation to the sustainable sector, social enterprises, social businesses, environmental based businesses, cultural businesses with philanthropy. Why you were so interested about it? Why did you pick these type of topics?
That's a very good question. I think some of it is, as you probably hinted at earlier, personal in terms of how my own worldview on, so a big part of the worldview that you find from, persons who you interact with in Jamaica and so on is one of wanting to give back, right? So in many cases, and it is a case for me where I grew up in, disadvantageous situations. I was not from a rich family, had, and something that many people wouldn't have, growing up with both parents, having siblings and so on. So I think I learned from early the value of being close, the solidarity of being with family, sharing with family. So I grew up with a sister who was like 1 year younger than I was. And so we basically shared everything. Anything you would have gotten, you'd have essentially automatically just thinking of sharing with my sister and so on. And that's how it was in the family. You saw examples of sharing, of understanding that, and the sharing happened within the family, but also outside. So whilst we weren't of, the best means, we didn't have a lot of money, you would share what you have with others in your community as well, right? So you got that sense growing up that, in life, if you're in a better off position than someone else, you share. But then there is this element that you try to keep, you try to have whoever you're sharing with, you keep that dignity. So it's not about sharing in a power, okay, I have it and you don't, and you share it. But the idea is to still understand that, even although they're benefiting, they also have something to share as well. So it's always about that That's reciprocal approach to sharing and the giving, right? So that was something that was embedded in me from early. I was at different stages in my life. I benefited from others, the kindness of others. And so I said philosophically and from our perspective, giving back and sharing with others became something that, I guess is expected. So it's literally something that is expected of you. I even see my, sojourn in academia as a way of giving back, right? Really, I had some persons ahead of me who really inspired me, who showed me that, in terms of my own capabilities, what I am capable of. And there are situations where other people don't have these types of inspiration, these mentors and so on, who show you, things that you wouldn't normally see. And so I think part of my journey is to provide that for other students. So for students who are probably at the university level, and when you're in first year, when you're in your undergraduate year, you're not really sure of what you want to do or how to do, where to go, and so on. So I see myself kind of in that light, that at one point in time I was in that situation, and so I am now in a position where I've learned a lot of things, I've experienced a lot of things, and so this opportunity gives me a chance to impart some of what I know, give other people, so pass it on, essentially pass on the inspiration, pass on the motivation, pass on the ideas, the thoughts, share ideas and thoughts and experiences with others as well. So as I said before, it has its genesis in family and my upbringing, how close-knit my family was, how my circle of friends were, how my extended network was, and how they guided me. And so, as I said, I was from a community that became violent after a while, so if I never had strong people around me, I probably tell you that in terms of agency, I knew that, violence wouldn't have been my option, but, having people around you, at a young age to kind of show you that there are other ways, other choices that you can make in life that can, give you different benefits. That was important. As I said, I can't say that, I would have been totally immune to the influences, but the fact that I had other influences, positive influences that gave me, a different perspective on life, that added to my own personal agency, it meant that, I could have successfully navigated what could have been, real life or death situations and decisions that I would have to make. I tell people all the while, I remember I'm very fascinated with sports. So I used to play football and cricket in my neighborhood. But then I noticed that when, teenage years, I started to see some of my friends who, we would be at the football field and people started to bring knives to the game. And I'm like, okay, so it changed. The dynamics of the situation changed. And, I've been able to see where some of these same guys who started out that way, many of them are not here today. Many of them are either in prison or dead because they chose a particular path. And so I can see where the potential was if I didn't have the mentors that I had at the time to kind of steer me away from certain things that I never saw as being dangerous. And in hindsight, you'd see it now that it was dangerous, but you weren't thinking it through in that respect. So that is how, and those are kind of the reasons why I have decided to take the path that I'm taking and see that there's a bigger role for me in terms of guiding others who might be in a similar, if not the same situation that I am in. I was in at the time when I was growing up.
Amazing, man. Thank you for sharing this story. So, how is growing up in Jamaica? How is the lifestyle based on your experience? Because I suppose I mean, the image that I have of this is like people are really chilled and cool. And of course, I mean, you face certain societal challenges which happen in the Caribbean, in Latin America. But how was your experience?
It was great. As I said, I can't complain about my upbringing. As I said, when I compare it to what I see in other places, I think, people will always compare and say, okay, in developed societies, they have all this technology. But I think I really value the simplicity of life then, So you could essentially go outside and find a fruit tree, get something, get a fruit off of a fruit tree. In the UK, in Europe and so on, it's a bit different. I guess you have rural areas that it might have it, but in terms of the urban spaces and so on, it's a little bit, not as, I think I remember doing sociology and this idea of Jeshua Shaw and Jamin Shaw from Ferdinand Told. This is something that sticks in my head, the idea of the mechanical versus the organic society. And that is how I kind of compare it. So the organic society where, you feel as if you can grow. There's space for you to grow and you're not kind of crowded in with buildings and structures, massive structures and infrastructure and so on. So you get a chance to still connect with nature. You're able to run around barefoot. You can. So there is. You can go to the river. You can go to the river and so on. So the things that you might not be able to do. Like I always struggle to say, you have the Thames in the UK, and you'd never try to go there for a swim because there's so it's pretty much similar. We'll go to the rivers, we'll go to the beaches, and there are pristine beaches, pristine rivers, and so you have that experience. You really live a life where until you get to adulthood, you really don't have to think a lot about much. You just go to school normally, you come home, get your homework done, and you go to play for a little bit, and then you go back home and so on. And so, it was the simple life. You didn't get caught up in all of the hustle and bustle of life. You had to take your education seriously because that is something that there's no discussion around for your parents. You have to be serious about your work. It is for them. It was the passport out of the life that we were living in terms of poverty and so on. So you had to take it seriously, and so you had to make sure that you were on the books and try to find a balance between the socialization, playing with your friends and so on, but also ensuring that you keep the educational side of stuff up to par. But yeah, it's as I said, it's organic in the sense that you had friends, family members. It's not a situation where you lived in a apartment and you weren't, so there was a bit of freedom to move about. There weren't as many structures and so on that kind of force you to be in one way or the other. So it was a good childhood growing up. I can't really complain if to tell you the truth.
Amazing, man. Thank you. So nowadays, okay, what do you think are the most societal challenges in Jamaica?
We are being influenced a lot by the North American culture in many different ways. We have a very big problem in terms of violence, gang violence, but also violence within, a lot of different spheres of our. So we have school violence as well being an issue. We have, I told you the issue of the tribal politics still remains. That is something that it's pervasive. So it's I think one of the biggest things for me is how politics has thwarted development overall. So we have persons who are thinking more about the success of their political parties than about the success of the country overall. And so what we'll find is that you have people are succeeding in spite of what is going on in terms of politics and the development, the decision making going on in the country. So a lot of what you see as positives for Jamaica internationally are things that people would have done without help from government per se. So many things that you see we achieve in terms of sports, in terms of culture and so on is done because of the goodwill of people and not necessarily decisions, strategic decision making on the part of government per se. So we have that as a big blight. So we have the lack of strategic planning, long-term planning being an issue for us, so we always joke about Jamaica being in a 5-year cycle, which is basically, every election cycle, that is how people think. So we're not thinking long-term, we're not thinking sustainable, we're not thinking about, all right, so 50 years, I remember some time ago seeing a documentary about the UK. It was about in early 2000s, and they were thinking about what was going to happen in 2050, and I'm like, wow, just a difference in mindset in terms of how we think about the development of our people. So we have the sustainable development goals and so on, but we get that sense that it's we have national development planning as well that is happening, but you just don't get the sense that decisions that are being made with these broader goals in mind, right? So I mentioned the issue of crime. I mentioned the issue of lack of long-term strategic planning. Those are some very broad ones. We have the economic situation as well, which feeds into those 2 points that I mentioned before. The absence of opportunity. People, young people coming up now without any real hope. So the issue of hope and opportunity. The job market is what it is. In recent times we've been hearing that we have, the macroeconomic indicators are looking up, but when you think about what is happening to the normal man in the street, he's suffering. He's not in the best of position, and so translating some of these economic benefits to the poor, to the less off in society is something that we're not making as much progress with as well. Education, I think we're missing out on, whilst we are normally we're brilliant people, so very, brilliant. If you check, you'll see in terms of different spheres of life, we have some of the best people all over, but then just the systems that are in place to, so my interest is in the persons who are falling through the cracks, so we have a brilliant system that shows you all the persons who are doing well, but we have a lot of persons who are not doing that well. And so how we prioritize education is something that I'm also interested in as well. Education as a single, for me, it has the power to lift not just an individual, but a generation out of, perpetual poverty. But if the systems that are in place are, I will probably argue to you that we have a system that where the aim is to keep certain people in certain positions. So the education system has a role to play in keeping some people at a particular level and elevating others. And so we have to kind of broaden the scope and understand that, education is a very powerful tool. And so the systems that are in place has to work to kind of ensure that the education system is working for as many persons as possible and not simply upholding some of the traditional, approaches to life. So in many cases, we have some debates going on now about grooming in schools, right? So recent newspaper articles speaking about, the length of guys' hair and whether females can wear Nubian knots to school, the length of skirts, whether or not the pants are too tight. And I'm saying that this is kind of a distraction. The aim, the essence of the education system is not simply to just uphold the status quo, which we should essentially be creating persons who are going to be thinking critically to be the next person who comes up with something that is groundbreaking, giving them the perspective to be creative. And so, but what we have really in the education system is, persons remaining, very much status quo, trying to keep things as they are through rules and policies and procedures that are not adding value to the education system, if I'm being honest, right? And so what we have are students who are less, they're disillusioned with the education system. They're not feeling as though the system is catering to their needs. And this is especially the case for boys. And we already understand how, the difference in how boys learn from how girls learn, And so many of the school, you expect the boys to be sitting, sitting in a classroom for 5-6 hours. That is not, that is really against what, essentially boys are explorers. You want to be getting them into spaces where they can be doing things and experiencing things. But the system is not created in that way. So we have uniformity. Everyone wears the same uniform. You have to think alike. You do rote learning. And then we expect them to become creative thinkers when they leave school. Yeah. When all you really gave them was to be, a factory. You're on the conveyor belt coming out. You shouldn't be doing anything different. You shouldn't try anything different. You should obey all rules that don't question any rules and so on. But then you want them to be entrepreneurs, when what the entrepreneur should be doing is questioning the things that are considered to be true and, real, right? So that's a challenge as well, very much a challenge in our space. So those, I think, are some of the general points that I would raise in terms of some of the things that are not going so well, and I would hasten to point out that we still operate, despite of all these challenges, we're still having some very successful things happening within the country nonetheless.
And in terms of the sustainability, I mean, global warming,
right.
climate change, is it hard?
Yeah, that's a very serious issue for us. A big part of our economy is tourism, and you can understand it for many. So the issue of the coral reefs being destroyed, we have a lot of beach erosion. So now Jamaica, we're having a big drought. Normal for this time of the year, but as I said, unseasonal. So it's longer than normal. You have those variations in climatic. So the hurricanes are stronger, lasting much longer, and so on. In Antigua, now we have this big phenomenon, this idea of the sargassum, which is something that is washing up on the shores. And again, affecting the tourism industry, affecting the environment in some ways, because when it washes up, as I said, it affects the fishermen as well, their livelihood and so on. And for us in the region, the idea of the blue economy is big. So we're trying to, as a region, to benefit from the ocean, the ocean and all the related activities that are happening in the ocean. And so, with things like the sargassum outbreak in many of the Caribbean islands as well, it has its impact on the environment, right? We also have issues of in recent times bushfires, so a lot of bushfires happening. The impact on the agricultural sector, the issue of food security is also big. And so, taking into account just the different ways. So many of these issues that we speak about have multiple kind of layers to the effect that it has on the society, right? We have farmers that, their livelihoods depend on the rain. or so in cases where we have, so sometimes we have the droughts, so they lose crops because of the droughts. Then we have unseasonally heavy rainfall, which means that you have flooding and land slippages, which means that they lose their crops ever so often. So all of these issues. I think the issue as well is we're also having in terms of demographics, the idea that we have an aging population as well. So there's many a concern about the fertility rates and reproduction. Whether or not we're going to have a situation where the state will have to be taking care of the elderly, while the working population is not as big as it used to be, and so on. So some of those developed country problems we're now having in terms of the population size and so on, and the level of the labor force and so on being very existential issues that we face in the region.
Wow. Fantastic, man. Thanks for that. I've been always fascinated by different philosophies, not around the world, especially when it relates to question the way that we consume, the way that we behave, towards the environment, concepts such as the buen vivir, Ubuntu, that you are also familiar with. And I remember you recommended me a couple of books about Rastafarian culture. I remember, let's start with Africa and the genesis of Rastafari. And also you recommended me, which is on my list, The Rastafari Roots of Ideology, written by Barry Chevon. So how, from the outside, what is the Rastafarian culture? And
Right.
in a way, how do you connect Rastafarian culture with this kind of sustainability sector, social and environmental sector?
That's an excellent kind of connection that you've made between both, because as I'd mentioned here earlier, a lot of the Rastafari culture revolves around African cosmologies. So their philosophies have a strong connection. So a big part of what they speak about is Pan-Africanism, the idea of advancing African and things African in our region. You can understand, being a society that was colonized, many of our retentions were lost. Many of our retentions were essentially played off as being negative or bad. So our spirituality, our spiritual beliefs and so on, our philosophies, cosmologies, as we mentioned before, were so essentially they were seen as being bad. They were seen as being negative. And so there's something I wanted to probably make a connection with. We have an issue within our society where it's called bleaching, and bleaching is literally physically trying to lighten the face. I think in Rwanda, a couple other African countries, we have that situation where people are trying to lighten their face. I think even in Dominican Republic is somewhere where you have it strong as well. In Brazil, people have made that connection, again, out of the colonial idea, imperialism, that certain persons of a particular hue are inferior, while others who have another hue are inferior. And so it has kind of become something that is ingrained. And so we have the issue of skin bleaching. And a big part of what the Rastafarian movement kind of stood for was the centrality of things African, embracing blackness, embracing your culture, the connections with Africa as our spiritual homeland, essentially, right? And if you understand the psychology of the colonizers, a big part of their approach was to preach this idea of black inferiority, right? So in order for them to keep, at that stage, you have to use, certain psychological methods to keep people in a position where they felt as if, and religion is one of those institutions that they use to achieve that, right? So a big part of the Rastafari philosophy is therefore challenging the perceptions of whiteness and this idea of the superiority of whiteness. And so it hit at the very heart of the approach that they used for, to perpetuate the colonial project, right? So that was a strong, the idea that black had, value and power is something that they latched onto. So they were very much a part of the Black Power movement, the Pan-African movement and so on. They also have a strong connection with the environment, right, in terms of their practices. So farming practices and so on. The understanding of the man's connection with the earth. They're very much, they're very big on the connection between man and the earth. And so sustainability comes in there because they understand their role as guardians of the earth, essentially, right? So, there's no bigger advocate for the idea of sustainable development than the Rastafarian. They understand that food security, our existence on this earth is kind of pivoted around us taking care of the earth, right? So you always hear them talk about Mother Earth. And so they understand that in order for the earth to remain fruitful, we have to be the custodians, the guardians of the earth, right? Then we look at the food aspect. So the idea of health and healthy lifestyle. A big part of what they deal with is ital living. So reduction in salts, reduction in meats, not reduction. So there is a variation. Some people will go fully no meat. So different variations of from vegetarian to vegan to ultra vegan. So, persons who, they're not going to cook any of the food that they eat. It's all, they call it ital. So no salts, no cooking of the food, or if you cook, it's minimal cooking and so on. So there's a big emphasis on the diet, right, and what you put in your body. Again, connected to a lot of what we look at in terms of sustainability. Now, in the Caribbean, we have a lot of people suffering from non-communicable diseases. So the idea that we're having high salts through hypertension and high sugars through diabetes and so on being a central part of the issues facing our populations. I know it's by extension, the African American societies and so on, but salt and sugar are the two main, things that are impacting on our healthy lifestyle. And so that is a big issue for them as well. The issue of healthy lifestyle and being very much attuned to what you eat, what you consume and so on, right? Also, this idea of love, the idea of, and it's interpreted in different ways. Love for self, first of all. The idea that, you're not any less off than anyone else, so the idea of Black empowerment in and of itself as an ideology. Also of questioning some of, the atrocities that came about because of the colonial project as well. So keeping in mind that, these are things that happen to us, and so we have the reparations movement, the idea that, people have to there has to be some sort of restitution for the damages done, through the institution of enslavement. So that's a big part of the strategy, as well as just the idea. There's one more thing that kind of slipped me. But when I get back to it, when the issue of culture. So a big part of what we look at is culture, not from the perspective of music alone, but from a retention of the things and of the ways in which we as a people. So when we conceptualize the issue of the double or triple bottom line in the social enterprise context, we actually see it as a quadruple bottom line. So we look at culture, we look at the social, the environmental, and the economic. So this idea that we want to bring forward of the quadruple bottom line, where culture is central to who we are as a people. You can't have, we can't be thinking through it and maybe making an assumption that is a part of what we do. But for us in this region, culture, in however you kind of conceptualize this, is important to who we are as a people and what we do. And so the manifestation is through reggae music, through dub poetry, and through this, this idea of universal love for self, but also love for others, right? So that, I think, kind of encapsulates the connection between the Rastafarian movement overall and the sustainable development, social economy, landscape.
Fantastic.
Hopefully at some point I'll get one of my mentors, Dr. Knife, to actually come on to. I'm sure he will provide you with a lot more insight into the connections between Rastafari and the sustainable development goals, or sustainability overall.
Fantastic.
And I'm also definitely interested in seeing, because I have also read a bit on the Buen Vivir, and I've seen, just how there are some convergences between, our conception of, Rastafari philosophy and Buen Vivir in relation to sustainability generally. So I've seen that the cultural kind of, the difference, but also similarities in terms of cultures and how that impacts on how we kind of see sustainability.
Dude, I was thinking, like, of course, you have this kind of profile to be driven by social change, and from your profession try to contribute to others. And I was wondering why you haven't become one Rastafarian.
Again, I missed part of what you said.
No, what I'm saying is, like, what I'm trying to say is, like, if you think about it, you have this profile of an agent of change, of, deliver sustainability or encourage others to practice this kind of, like, organizational behavior in terms of protecting the environment, contributing to society. Why you haven't become a Rastafarian?
I think, for me, and they'll tell you this, that it has a lot to do with how you think. So
Yeah.
the manifestation of it is in, so you grow your locks and so on. But for them, well, they don't like ideologies. They call it's a way of living. So it's for them, they don't want it to be institutionalized as religion is. So they'll tell you all the while, it's a liberty, it's a way of life, and not a religious. It's a spirituality and a way of life, not a religion. And so for me, I have adopted a lot of the principles, just in terms of how they live, and I've kind of, internalized some of what I've seen, the elements that I think are important to how, I think life should be, right? How I think I should be, how I should act, how I should behave in life. And so that is kind of how I see it. I don't, necessarily think that I have to, wear the locks for it to manifest the ideas and the thoughts, of the approach, right? So that is kind of just me, in terms of, as I said, I think the locks is, I guess, for some people, a visual representation that this is the path that they're following, but there are many others who support it without, essentially, putting growing their locks and so on.
Yeah. Another
Right.
another topic which I love to talk about is post-colonial studies, and I love to talk about this especially with you. Actually, one of the things that I learned from you is how the story can vary or be very different based on the culture of the writers. In fact, you gave me an extensive list of books to understand African history from the African scholars and writers. And I recall the work of Chiek Ante Diop with the
Yes.
African origins of civilization.
Yes.
And of course, the work of Walter Rodney, how
Yes.
Europe and that developed Africa, right? So I was wondering, why do you reckon it's so important to understand Africa or the Caribbean, and its history, based upon, Afro descendants or African scholars? What do you think is so important?
Right. So I think you also need to add to that list Frantz Fanon. He wrote a couple of different
Yes.
books that I think important to our understanding of the psychology behind our experiences as Africans within the space. So there are many others that have covered it. I think I said the list is, so you have a lot of African American authors as well that covered, but I've probably given you some of the Caribbean kind of focused authors. And the idea is for me that we've always heard this idea that victory is often told from the perspective of the victors, and that has been something,
It's
something
true, man.
yeah. So I always make this joke to my friends that across Europe I've seen the Arc de Triomphe in every country. Like all these countries have won something, so they've always been trying to project this idea. So I've been to Spain and I've seen the Arc de Triomphe in Spain. I've seen it in the UK. I've seen it in France. So all the European countries I've been to, it has been a story of victory, of winning, of all, and that is not the full extent of the story, because it hasn't told the untold destruction that has been caused in furtherance of this, victory that they're in search of. And so I think I'm also, and this would be one of your, the colonial school authors, Arturo Escobar,
Yeah, of course.
and his work as
Encounter
well.
development. Yeah.
Yes. And so, again, I think the influence goes both ways, because I'm seeing it also from the perspective of the Latin American writers as well, where the idea still is that we have a story to tell. And so, how that is told. And I think, let me just probably bring you back to something that I had. So when I was in high school, right, and again, it brings you back to the importance of education. So I was being taught European history in high school, right? So I learned about Napoleon and his great conquest, how he, went across Europe trying to, all the great exploits of Napoleon, right? And at that stage I was about 15, 16. I was like, so, all right, so I've heard about Europeans and what they've done, but what about, what about our people? Do we have a history outside of the the enslavement period that many talked about? And so you'd have been reading in the curriculum Caribbean history from the perspective of slavery. So you're saying, all right, so there's nothing else that would have happened to us as a people. What happened? Right? What happened to us before slavery? What happened? What about our civilizations and so on? So I think I'm grateful to my history teacher for exposing me to what happened in African societies before slavery. So I learned of the agricultural kind of innovations that they came up with, how they structured governance, how the societies were, which is something that we didn't hear before. You know, we weren't exposed to that in our classes. So it felt as though we were you know, prehistoric. We were people who didn't have a culture, we didn't have a civilization. So I didn't hear about the Mali civilization. We didn't hear that you had Timbuktu, you had universities in these spaces, right? You didn't know that the Greece went to modern day Ethiopia to study. You didn't hear these things. These are not things that were shared. You didn't hear that, you know, we had our own, you know, persons who would have gone to the heights in terms of education. But we're hearing about Plato, we're hearing about Aristotle, we're hearing about, you know, all these people. But these people actually went to, you know, these different places to learn, right? But we wouldn't have gotten that in our system. And so I've read also this guy, he's called Yosef Ben Hokanan, and he speaks about these things as well. He's in the same ilk as Cheikh Ante Diop, where they're talking about what, you know, so they question even, you know, this notion of Egyptology, you know, and they, you know, this idea that, you know, what they're trying to do essentially with Egyptology is to show that is to kind of make Egypt seem as though it was a white space. It was Caucasian, right? And that is the essence of Egyptology, of Egyptology, to kind of show that this is what the society was, right? And it wasn't, you know, none of these persons were black, you know. So again, that type of collective erasure that happens, right? Where if we can't say it is not, Caucasian, it means that, you know, it's nothing that we should know about. It's not, you know. And so back to just my history teacher kind of introducing me to some literature where I was able to understand that there was more to us. There was more to.
It's okay. It's okay. Go ahead. Go for the fun. It's fine, man. It's an informal thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I get back to it. But there was more to it than than we were being told. And again, because we weren't writing books, you know, there were, you know, we didn't have the opportunity to tell our own stories. And I think that is important. That's, if you understand the makeup of academia and of book writing, it's those who have access to writing books that told the stories, and those weren't people of, you know, African descent, people from Latin America and the Caribbean. We didn't get to start tell our own stories, and so we always got the stories of the victors, right? So the perspective is important, very, very important. And so we started to see that there was indeed Black excellence. There were people who were doing things long before that we didn't hear about, you know, doing things that, you know, we had systems. We weren't prehistoric and barbaric and lived in huts. You know, we had people who were building stuff. You know, we think about Egypt and they still haven't cracked the code in terms of how these guys built the pyramids, by looking at, you know, the checking out the stars, you know, how they use, you know, the stars to, so it's amazing the things that we'd have done, but, you know, how it has been told to us meant that we couldn't really understand our greatness, you know. And I think that's part of why my connection with Marcus Garvey and what he wanted to do. He wanted to use his platform to let everyone know. You know, he wants to make the connection between us in the diaspora, because we call, you know, all of us over this side in the West who are not on continental, the continental Africa, are in the diaspora. And so he wanted to make that connection between us and them, and as a part of us to understand that our legacy or history goes way beyond the enslavement period.
Yeah, and this is really interesting, man, because it's kind of like it connects me with two things. Okay, on the one hand, I'd say Spivak. Have you ever heard about
Yes.
Spivak?
Yeah, I
When
think
she
you mentioned him to me. I
yeah,
haven't done
yeah,
as
yeah,
much reading as him as I think I should have, but yeah, you've
and
mentioned him
she's
to me.
got yes, exactly, and she offers this fantastic concept of subaltern. Which
Yeah,
refers to
yeah.
those who don't give orders; they only
Yeah,
receive orders. And he kind of like develop and elaborate this relationship between colonizer and colonized. Okay,
yeah,
and on the other hand, I never gonna forget the Lynch's letter that you
yeah,
suggested me to go through, man. It was
yeah.
heartbreaking. And actually, for our audience, I strongly recommend you to look for it, because
Mhm.
you can see how systematically it was a development of a methodology, you know, to kind of like silence people,
Yes.
give the like maybe stealing their voice, right? And nowadays
Mhm.
we can see how, in a way they kind of like inherited this attitude towards people, right? It's very
Yes.
interesting. And that's why I love always to talk about you about these kind of post-colonial studies,
Yes.
and how it still affecting our society, right?
Yes. Yes. So that's something that, I said, we have spoken about it at length in terms of how the remnants of these institutions, because I say it in that, I'm using very deliberate words in terms of the institutionalization of state, and they've used, and I'll say it, I tell people, I say it, and maybe controversial, they've used the church as an institution to perpetuate certain inferiority. So the references to black in the Bible, references to white, two different things. If you look at just imagery, and imagery is very, very important. Then they've used very brutal methods, the lynching, the quartering, the various forms of punishment that they would have used, whippings and so on, as ways of reinforcing, this dominance, this inferiority, how they treated people as less than humans, breeding, how they sold people in markets, like commodity, so all of those, the family structure. So I tell people I maintain this thought that um, a lot of the institutions that we have were essentially perpetuated in the way they are. So we look at family structures. So we had a very deliberate attempt to emasculate men in families, right? So you have them as the ones who would procreate, but you didn't have them as playing a role within the the general society. So you diminish their role. And if you can understand the impact that has now, we have a lot of single mothers having families. So the role of the father within some of these societies. And again, it's a thesis. As I said, some people, it's a big debate. People will argue that, okay, so we have been out of slavery for this long. Why hasn't it changed? We have evidence of nuclear family structures, but for the more, we have a lot of also, single family households, because, the idea of the family wasn't strengthened. The men were systematically emasculated and their role within the family diminished significantly during slavery and so on. So a lot of that for me still resonates. Not very good in terms of, just how we want our boys to grow. You love for them to have that balance between the mother and the father energy. I am an advocate of that. Balance is needed for a child to grow, even for females, for young girls, that she needs that example of who a protector should be, what a male figure should be in her life, a father, what he does, protecting, guiding, and so on. When that is absent, you have them trying to search for this assurance, this protection, and that can have its impact in terms of how it manifests itself. So the way in which it was done, as I said before, they use subtle ways. Other times they use very brutal ways to achieve those ends that they had, of ensuring that their institution, the slavery institution, remained and was not challenged in any significant way.
Fantastic, man. Thank you for that. Going back to our ecosystem, no, the sustainable ecosystem and so on. And I was wondering, like, what do you think are your drivers to keep working on this sector? What do you think are your drivers to keep going into research and teaching in relation to this sustainable sector? And do you think is it worthy to do that?
Right. So for me, it is really an existential issue for us. I think a lot of the things that were mentioned earlier, the issue of culture and the importance of culture to us, the importance of the environment to us as small island developing states, the issue of the social side of things, how we relate to each other, again, connected to the issue of culture, but separate in many respects. All of them remain important to understand and to continue to test. And so in recent times, so because the field is young in the Caribbean, it requires that amount of work. So I'm really happy with the way in which the work has taken off in Latin America and in some other spaces, Europe as well, and a lot of literature around it. And so in the Caribbean region, it has that dual effect. So we're trying to understand practice. And the reason why research remains important is because a lot of things are happening from the practical perspective that needs to be spoken about and documented, right? So we have recently a social stock exchange was started in Jamaica, and I am saying that we need to understand it. We even in some developed or mature jurisdictions, you don't have stock exchanges, right? Social stock exchanges. And so we need to understand all the practices that are happening, which is why I think research remains important. It might not have the same level of importance as, say, economics in the Caribbean. So we prefer these hard kind of science, the science field, and the economics, the more hard subjects, the core subjects that are based on facts are given priority. But understanding interactions remain important. And so a lot of what happens within our society is social, right? So we need to understand how, the impact of policy and so on. So I think the work is still relevant, and it is relevant because we have a thriving third sector. Again, the issue that we have is of government and private sector not essentially being in tune with what is happening with the people. So the third sector is important, and so the sustainability of that sector is important. So understanding what is happening will help to get us to the stage where we put sustainability at the forefront for an actor that is doing work that both the government and the private sector are not fully capable of or willing to do. So it is important, I say, for us to continue that work, to understand what is happening, but also to help to frame the practice, kind of push the practice in particular directions as well. When you don't have a strong policy framework, and we don't have that as yet, we're having, really what we have is policy kind of trying to catch up with practice. And so you need the research as a part of it, as that tripartite system where you have policy. So you need the research to be understanding what is happening in practice to also then inform what is happening in policy. So I think, that three-pronged approach is critical to, understanding sustainability within the third sector, and also to understand the role that needs to be played by private sector and government in terms of, advancing, all the different indicators that we have, both as it relates to the sustainable development goals, but also our national development planning as well.
Fantastic. So do you think, like, as a professional, do you sometimes struggle, just because we're still a niche? I mean, unfortunately, like, these kind of topics aren't relevant yet. Okay.
Yes.
Now they're becoming more popular. We have the SDGs, which in a way, it helps to give us, stage to talk about these topics, right? So sometimes do you feel, oh, maybe I'm give up and go to, the orthodox way of, organizations and, uh, business as usual, and so on? Or
Yeah, so that is always, that's something that will cross your mind, but then you also think about, and I think I said this in my thesis, you have those unsung heroes that are doing work that is not essentially being captured. So we have the economics, we have the public sector side of things, and they're able to document what they're doing, but we have a sector that there's a lot of work, they're essentially the invisible glue that is keeping our society running, right? And these solidarity, these social economic type of activities that are happening are essentially stopping the gap. So if these persons were not doing what they're doing, and I always speak about this idea of the counterfactual, what if the third sector and people within the third sector were not doing what they were doing? What would happen? And that is a question that always keeps me grounded and keep going. So these persons who don't see any other options, they're in this thing and they're saying, if I'm not doing it, it will not be done. No one else will do it. Who will take care of these persons who are less fortunate, right? And so that is kind of the thing that keeps me motivated, that, we're in the right field, we're doing the right things. And, for many of these organizations, they are not sustainable, which is why, moving towards the idea of social entrepreneurship is important for them. So it's magnifying the work that they've been doing. They're doing a lot of work, but then they can't continue in the same way that they've been doing it, because the funding models that they have are archaic, they're outdated. And so you have to be thinking of new ways of keeping yourself alive and keeping going. And if you don't have these new ways, you will have problems. And so that is kind of one of the things that keeps me going in terms of, having faith that this field will grow. I look at how the field has grown in Jamaica, both entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, and I'm saying it needs a similar level of effort on my part and on others to expose people to the areas, let them understand how it connects with what we're doing. It's not divorced. It can be a part of the strategy. It doesn't mean that we need essentially an economic strategy only, but we need a social strategy as well, a third sector strategy. They have been important to the work that we've been doing since independence, even before. So it doesn't make it any less important to do, in these days and time, especially when governments can't do all that they need to do. They have government failure, there's private sector failure in many respects. The meltdowns, various meltdowns that we have had in, the Great Depression time, in the oil crisis time, in the early 2000s when we had the recession, and in recent times we had COVID and so on, are example that governments and private sector on their own, if left out to their own devices, are going to neglect the social side. So we need actors in the social sector to continue that work.
fantastic, man. Listen, the last question, and I like to formulate these, especially for the sake of our audience, is what book or perhaps a movie that inspired you, you'd like to share with us?
All right. There's so many. There's so many. One that I did recently that continues to resonate with me is The Alchemist by
Coelho.
Squelo.
Yeah, beautiful.
Very, very, very deep book. Very simple, but very deep in terms of the issues that it's dealing with. Right? I will always plug the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey as well. You know, I'm not going to leave him out any at all for obvious reasons. You would have already mentioned how Europe underdeveloped Africa, the work of Walter Rodney, but also one I think I mentioned to you as well, the Groundings with My Brother, which kind of documented his connection with Rastafari in Jamaica. I think you definitely need to read that one as well. Just for
Why is that?
context.
Why is that? Which one is this?
It's called Groundings with My Brother, and it's by Walter Rodney.
Ah, okay, yeah. Ooh,
You need
beautiful.
to see. You need,
Yes.
so it shows you. So he was at the time he returned from his PhD. So he did his PhD in SOAS, which is the University of London, right?
Yeah, of course.
And he went to Tanzania to study to teach for a little bit at the University of Dar es Salaam. And so he came back to the Caribbean and got a post by the University of the West Indies in Mona. And he had this thing now where he wanted to understand the Jamaican culture. And so he went to the source. So the idea that, you know, these guys were preaching Pan-Africanism and so on. And that was a big part of Walter Rodney's work, you know, so connecting the African continent with the issues surrounding Africa. And he learned so much as a scholar. He was a very bright man, but he understood that there was a lot that he could learn from these guys, these Rastafari ones. And so he connected with them and learned a lot and shared a lot with them as well. So it was, again, the idea of reciprocity. You know, so he didn't go there saying, oh, I am this. You know, I did a scholarship, I did my PhD, so I know everything about Africa. He learned so much about Africa and how, you know, the Rastafari ideology and cosmology from these Rastafari brethren. And so, as I said, the fact that he wrote a book on it kind of told you just how influential this connection was between himself and the Rastafari movement. So I think that's a good, thinking about it now, that's a good book I think you could check out.
I will.
Yes.
And I hope our audience also, they do. Fantastic,
Yes.
man.
Yes.
Ed, dude, thanks a lot for your time. I know you are a very busy person. I'm pretty sure like everybody's gonna enjoy what we just talked today.
Yes.
And thanks a lot, man.
You're welcome. I really hope the audience, you know, I don't know, you know, how they are varied. I figure they're varied. I know your reach is very wide. So, but yeah, thank you for having me. You know, very thought-provoking questions. Really, you know, had me thinking. You know, so I like that type of engagement all the time. As always, anytime we meet and talk, there's always that, you know, chance of us being able to share with each other.
Sure.
I think that is what the podcast is about, more than likely. And you know, it really was it was very good for me as well.
Big time, man. Thanks. I'm just gonna stop. Wait.